In the year 836 AD, a fleet of Viking longships rounded the headland and beached on the east coast of Ireland. The raiders drew their swords and ran inland toward a farming settlement they had spotted from the water. By the time they reached the cluster of round houses, the village was empty. The cattle were still in the field. The fire pits were still warm. There was bread on a table, but there were no people. The Vikings searched the houses, kicked over the floor mats, looked behind every wall. Nothing. The villagers had not run. They were still there. About 15 feet underground, packed into a stone passage built specifically for that moment, listening to the boots above their heads. The Irish built more than 3,500 of these tunnels. We call them souterrains. Almost nobody talks about them anymore. This is the story of who built them, how they worked, and why an entire population learned to vanish into the ground beneath their feet. To understand why an entire population learned to disappear into the earth, you have to understand what Ireland looked like in the year 800. The island had no cities, no castles, and no central government. It was divided into roughly 150 small kingdoms called tuatha, each ruled by a local king who answered to a regional overking, who in turn paid tribute to one of the provincial kings of Connaught, Ulster, Leinster, or Munster. Most people lived in extended family groups on small farms scattered across the countryside. The standard home was a ring fort called a rath or leos in Old Irish. Archaeologists have catalogued more than 45,000 of them across Ireland, making the ring fort the most common ancient monument in the country. A ring fort was a circular enclosure roughly 30 to 50 metres across, about 100 to 160 feet, surrounded by an earthen bank and a ditch. Inside lived a single family or two. They kept cattle, grew oats and barley, and stored their dairy in wooden vats sunk into the ground. These people were not poor. The early medieval Irish economy ran on cattle. A wealthy farmer might own 40 or 50 head, kept communally with neighbours for grazing. Their churches were stone. Their craftsmen worked gold. The monasteries at Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, and Iona produced manuscripts that scholars across Europe travelled to study. But the Irish had one major weakness. They had no army. There was no professional military. Each tuath fielded its own warriors, usually a few dozen men, when called by their king. There were no watchtowers along the coast. There was no navy. The country had been at peace internally for centuries, give or take a few cattle raids between neighbours. In 795 AD, a fleet of ships appeared off the north coast of Ireland, and the entire system that had kept the country safe for 400 years was about to collapse in a single afternoon. The first recorded Viking raid on Ireland landed at a small island called Rechru, which historians now identify as either Rathlin Island off the Antrim coast or Lambay Island near Dublin. The Annals of Ulster, written by Irish monks who survived these years, recorded what happened with brutal economy. The burning of Rechru by the heathens, and Skye was overwhelmed and laid waste. Skye was the Hebrides. The Vikings had just sacked 2 coastal regions on a single campaign and left. They came back the next year, and the year after that. By 820 AD, the raids were no longer a coastal nuisance. The Vikings had figured out that Irish rivers were navigable for miles inland, and that monasteries deep in the country held more silver and gold than any coastal target. They sailed up the Shannon, the Liffey, the Boyne. They burned Armagh 3 times. They sacked Glendalough so often the monks stopped rebuilding the wooden structures. Then they did something the Irish had never seen before. They stayed. Around 841 AD, a Viking force established a fortified camp at the mouth of the Liffey River. They called it a long fort, a ship fort. It became the city of Dublin. Within 20 years, long forts had appeared at Cork, Waterford, Limerick, and Wexford. The Vikings now had permanent bases inside Ireland from which they could raid year-round. For the rural farming population, this changed everything. Before the long forts, a Viking raid was a one-day event in summer. After the long forts, raids became a year-round threat that could happen any morning. A column of armed men could appear over the ridge at any time, and ordinary farming families had two options. They could run for the hills, leaving behind everything they owned, or they could fight a battle they would lose. Then somewhere in the 9th century, in scattered settlements across Ulster, Louth, and the Central Plains, the Irish came up with a third option. They started digging. The earliest souterrains we can date with confidence sit between roughly 500 and 750 AD. These were probably storage chambers, simple stone-lined cellars under the floor of a house used to keep dairy and meat cool. But after 800 AD, the construction changed. The chambers got deeper. The entrances got smaller. The passages got narrower. Engineers added features that made no sense for storing cheese. What made perfect sense was hiding from people who were trying to find you. A souterrain was not a cave. It was a piece of engineering as deliberate as a Roman aqueduct, built without mortar, without iron, without a single tool the modern construction industry would recognize. The builder would dig a trench in the soil, usually starting from inside a ring fort or under a house floor. The trench was about 1.2 meters wide and 1.5 meters deep, roughly 4 feet by 5 feet. He would line both walls with dry stone construction, large flat stones stacked carefully so each stone above bridged the gap between two stones below. The stones held themselves in place by their own weight and friction. No mortar was used because mortar was unnecessary, and because mortar would have failed under the wet pressure of Irish soil within a generation. The roof was the masterpiece. The builder had two options. The first was the linteled roof, where flat slabs were laid across the top of the walls like railroad ties. This was simple, but limited the width of the chamber to about 1.5 meters. The second was the corbelled roof, where each course of stones jutted inward slightly farther than the one below it, until the two walls met at the top in a peaked or rounded ceiling. A corbelled chamber could be 3 meters wide, roughly 10 feet, and stable for 1,000 years. Some still are. Once the structure was built, the trench was backfilled with soil. The grass grew back over the top. Within a season, you could walk over a 30-meter souterrain, about 100 feet long, and have no idea it was there. The entrance was the key. A souterrain's entrance was usually a hole in the floor of a house or a hidden hatch in the wall of a ring fort. Once you dropped down, the passage was rarely more than 1 meter high, sometimes as low as 60 centimeters, about 2 feet. You crawled. Then the engineering got serious. About halfway down a typical passage, the builder installed a feature called a creep. The passage would suddenly narrow to a hole barely wider than a man's shoulders. To get through, you had to lie flat on your stomach and squirm forward, your arms extended in front of you. You could not carry a sword through a creep. You could not crawl through a creep wearing chainmail. And the moment your head and shoulders cleared the far side, the people on the other side could simply hit you with anything they liked while you lay pinned, half in and half out, unable to defend yourself. This was not the only trap. A well-built souterrain had 3 or 4 chambers connected by passages of varying difficulty. The first chamber was the closest to the entrance, often used for routine storage of dairy and grain. The constant temperature inside, between 8 and 10 degrees Celsius year-round, or about 46 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, kept butter solid in summer and milk from freezing in winter. But beyond the first chamber, the design changed. The next passage might dip suddenly into a sump, a section dropped below the main floor level that filled with groundwater after rain. Anyone trying to follow you in had to wade through cold water in the dark. Then came another creep, then maybe a side passage that branched off and ended in a dead end, useful for confusing pursuers. Some souterrains had what archaeologists call a guard chamber, a small alcove built next to a creep where a defender could wait with a club or a knife and ambush anyone who came through. The deepest chambers were almost always at the far end, behind every obstacle. These were the refuge chambers, large enough to hold an extended family of 15 or 20 people for several days. They had air vents, narrow stone-lined shafts that ran up to the surface, often disguised among rocks in a field. Some had small slits in the walls that allowed the people inside to see and hear what was happening above. The strategic logic was straightforward. When raiders appeared, the entire population of a settlement could disappear underground in under 5 minutes. Once inside, they pulled a stone slab over the entrance and waited. The Vikings could burn the village. They could steal the cattle. They could spend hours searching for hidden cellars. But the entrance to a souterrain was nearly impossible to find without prior knowledge of where it was. If the raiders did find the entrance, they faced a choice. They could leave, or they could go in. Going in meant crawling, alone, through narrow passages designed to trap and kill them. A single defender at a creep could hold off dozens of attackers indefinitely, because only one person could come through at a time, and that person was helpless during the few seconds of the squeeze. The math favoured the defenders absolutely. The Annals of Ulster contain dozens of entries about Viking raids, including specific accounts of monasteries being sacked and kings being killed. They contain almost no entries about underground refuges being breached. There is a reason for that. As far as we can tell from the archaeological record, they almost never were. The most striking evidence of how souterrains worked under siege does not come from any single dramatic find. It comes from the pattern that emerges across more than a century of excavations. In the inner chambers of souterrains across Ireland, archaeologists have repeatedly recovered the same suite of artefacts: butchered animal bones, fragments of cooking and storage vessels, charred remains of small fires, personal items like bone needles and spindle whorls, the kind of things you do not lose, you abandon when you have to leave in a hurry. These chambers were not occupied for a few minutes. They were occupied for days, sometimes longer. The people inside had brought supplies, butchered animals to eat, lit small fires for warmth, and lived underground in sealed stone chambers while something terrible was happening on the surface above them. We rarely know what the something was. We do not know whether the families inside came out to find their houses burned, or whether they came out to find that the raiders had given up and moved on. But we know they survived, because someone resealed the entrance behind them, and many of those entrances stayed sealed for the next 1,000 years. The Donoughmore souterrain in County Louth gives the clearest picture. Its passage runs for nearly 30 metres underground, about 100 feet. 2 separate creeps, a guard chamber, a final refuge room large enough to hold a family of 20. The entrance was hidden inside the inner building of a ring fort, accessible only to people who already knew it was there. When archaeologists studied the site in the 20th century, the conclusion was unambiguous. This was not storage. This was a fortress, built specifically to outlast a raid. The Vikings raided Ireland for roughly 250 years before the final Norse defeat at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. During that quarter of a millennium, they killed Irish kings, looted dozens of monasteries, and built 5 major coastal cities. They never broke the rural population. The farming families of Ulster, Louth, Meath, and Munster kept growing oats, breeding cattle, and raising children, because every time the longships appeared on the horizon, they had somewhere to go. Souterrains stopped being built around 1200 AD. The reason was not that the threat ended. The reason was that the threat changed. The Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland began in 1169, when an army led by Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, landed in Wexford. The Normans brought something the Vikings never had. They brought stone castles. A motte and bailey, and later a stone keep, was a fortification that stayed in one place. It allowed a small number of armoured knights to control a large area of countryside permanently. Once the Normans built a castle, the local population could not just hide for a few hours and emerge to find the threat gone. The threat lived in the castle now. Hiding underground was useful against raiders who came and left. It was useless against an occupying force that intended to stay. The souterrain became obsolete almost overnight. By 1250, no new ones were being built. By 1400, the existing ones were either forgotten, used as storage, or filled in. For the next 600 years, souterrains slept under Irish fields. Farmers occasionally fell through the roofs of collapsed ones while ploughing. Cattle sometimes vanished into them and had to be hauled out. Local folklore turned them into fairy passages and puka dens, holes in the world where the old people had gone. The Irish word for an underground chamber, uam, became a word for any unexplained hole in the ground. The first systematic study of souterrains began in the 19th century, when antiquarians started recording sites they had stumbled into, often after a farmer's plough collapsed a roof slab. The pace picked up in the 20th century with the work of archaeologists like Etienne Rhin, who spent decades cataloguing souterrain sites across Connaught. The standard reference today is Mark Clinton's 2001 study, The Souterrains of Ireland, published by Wordwell. Clinton spent years in the field, walking ring forts, dropping down into chambers, measuring passages with a tape and a flashlight. His work confirmed what fragmented earlier surveys had hinted at. The souterrain was not a curiosity. It was a continental-scale defensive system, distributed across the entire farming landscape of medieval Ireland. The Discovery Programme and the National Monument Service of Ireland now maintain detailed records of more than 3,500 documented souterrains. Field surveys continue to find new ones every year, especially in counties Antrim, Down and Louth, where the highest densities are concentrated. A handful of souterrains are open to the public. Donamore in Louth has been preserved with electric lighting and a guide. Drumina Cashel in County Down has a souterrain you can crawl into yourself if you bring a flashlight and don't mind the cold. The chambers are exactly as the builders left them: the dry stone walls, the corbelled ceilings, the narrow creeps that no Viking ever made it through. For 700 years, the rural population of Ireland solved a problem most cultures could not solve. They were attacked by an enemy stronger than they were, and they had no army to fight back with. They could not build castles. They could not field a navy. They had no professional soldiers and no central state to coordinate defence. What they had was stone, soil, and the knowledge that the ground beneath their feet could be reshaped. So they reshaped it. They built more than 3,500 underground refuges across an island the size of Indiana. They carried their families, their food, and their futures into the dark. And when the longships were gone, they came back up and rebuilt the houses above. In a forest in southern Småland, Sweden, there is a cabin you can walk right past without seeing. Its sod roof sits almost level with the ground. Moss and grass cover it completely. From 10 feet away, it looks like a small hill between the trees. Step closer and you notice a wooden door set into the earth, a single window and a stone chimney barely poking above the soil. This is a backstuga, a type of home that once dotted the forests and hillsides of southern Sweden by the tens of thousands. The word means slope cottage. These were homes built directly into the side of a hill, using the earth itself as one or more walls. They were small, typically about 20 square metres, and most had a single room dug halfway into the ground, with stone or timber walls on the remaining sides, and a sod roof that blended into the landscape above. The Swedish government recorded just over 28,000 backstugas in 1805. By 1885, that number had grown to 50,000. By 1910, only 22,658 remained. Today, almost none are left. This is the story of the backstuga. Who built them, why they were dug into the earth, what made them work in brutal Scandinavian winters, and why an entire category of Swedish housing vanished in less than a century. What did a backstuga look like? Walk up to a backstuga, and the first thing you notice is how low everything is. The door was often so low you had to duck to enter. Visitors to Arsla Torg, Sweden's largest preserved collection of backstugas outside Falköping, still have to bow their heads to pass through the doorways. The construction followed one basic principle: let the hill do most of the work. A builder would find a south-facing slope, the warmest side of a hill, where sunlight would reach the front wall and door. He would dig into the hillside, carving out a space roughly the size of a modern living room. The exposed earth of the slope became the back wall, and in some backstugas, the hill also formed parts of the two side walls. That meant the builder only needed to construct 2 or 3 walls out of actual building materials. In Småland and other parts of southern Sweden, where timber was expensive, those remaining walls were often built from fieldstone gathered from the surrounding land. In areas where wood was more available, the walls were simple log construction. One backstuga near Konga, built in 1859 by a worker at a nearby ironworks, was constructed with 3 walls of stacked fieldstone and only a single wall of wood for the front. The roof was the most important part. Builders laid rough wooden planks across the top, then covered them with overlapping sheets of birch bark for waterproofing. Over the bark went 2 layers of sod cut from nearby fields. The first layer went grass side down against the bark, the second grass side up so it would continue growing. Within a season, the roof looked like the hillside itself. The weight of the wet sod pressed down on the log walls beneath, compressing every joint and sealing gaps that would otherwise let in drafts. Inside, a single room served every purpose. A clay or stone hearth sat against one wall, its chimney running up through the sod roof. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with flat stones. Furniture was minimal: a bed frame, a table, a stool or bench, and wall-mounted shelves. Most backstugas had 1 window, maybe 2, and those windows were small. Light came mainly from the fire and from tallow candles. The ceiling was low, sometimes barely 6 feet, but these were not temporary shelters. They were permanent homes, lived in year-round, sometimes for generations. Who lived here and why? Here is what most people get wrong about backstugas. They were not farmhouses. The people who lived in them were called backstugusittare, literally slope cottage sitters, and the term carried a very specific meaning in Swedish society. It meant you owned no land, you farmed no fields, and you were, in the legal and social framework of rural Sweden, the lowest class of the countryside. The backstugusittare were different from torpare, tenant farmers who rented land and worked it in exchange for labour or payment. A torpare had a lease, a contract, a recognised place in the farming economy. A backstugusittare had none of that. They lived on someone else's property or on the common land of a village, in a cottage built on ground useless for agriculture, a rocky slope, a patch of bog edge, a strip of forest too steep to plough. They survived on odd jobs, handicrafts and charity. Some worked as day labourers during harvest season. Some were weavers, basket makers or woodworkers. Some were elderly people who could no longer work, retired servants, or families with no relatives to take them in. A small patch of ground, if the landowner allowed it, might support a potato garden and a few chickens or a goat. The Swedish government disliked the backstugusittare because they paid no taxes. The cottage sat on someone else's land, so the property tax was the landowner's problem. Since Bakstugusitare were not registered as independent households in the land registry, they were nearly invisible to the state. Before 1846, parishes were technically forbidden from housing paupers in Bakstugas, but many did it anyway because the alternative was worse. The legal alternative, called rotagong, was a system where the poor were rotated from farm to farm, staying 1 or 2 days at each, in a fixed schedule. Nobody liked it. So the Bakstuga became a quiet solution to an ugly problem. Build a hut on a useless hillside, let someone live there, give them a few days of work when you need extra hands, and avoid the cost of a poorhouse. It was the cheapest possible answer to the question of what to do with people who had nowhere else to go. Why digging into a hill actually worked. The Bakstuga was built out of poverty. Its builders chose to dig into a hill because they could not afford enough timber for 4 walls. But by accident they created a dwelling with thermal properties that modern engineers now study on purpose. In southern Sweden, winter air can drop to -15 degrees Celsius or 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and summer air can reach 30 degrees Celsius or 86 Fahrenheit, a range of 45 degrees Celsius throughout the year. But at a depth of about 2 meters, soil in Scandinavia holds steady between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius, roughly 41 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. A Bakstuga built into a hillside had earth pressing against its back wall and parts of its side walls. That earth acted as a massive thermal buffer, warmer than the outside air in winter and cooler in summer. The sod roof added to this effect. 6 inches of soil and living grass on top of birch bark created insulation that worked in both directions, keeping heat from escaping in winter and the sun's heat from penetrating in summer. The grass roots held the soil together and prevented erosion, while the birch bark beneath shed water sideways, keeping the wooden roof structure dry. The south-facing orientation was not random. That side of a hill receives the most sunlight in the northern hemisphere. In winter, when the sun sits low, its light would hit the front wall and windows directly, warming the interior during the shortest days of the year. In summer, when the sun sits higher, the overhanging earth of the hillside above naturally shaded the front, preventing overheating. The US Department of Energy notes that earth-sheltered homes can save up to 80% on heating costs compared to conventional above-ground buildings. A house exposed to -7 Celsius, 20 Fahrenheit, air needs to be heated 28 degrees to reach a comfortable 21 Celsius or 70 Fahrenheit. A house surrounded by 13 Celsius, 55 Fahrenheit, earth only needs to be heated 8 degrees. The Bakstugusitare did not know these numbers. They knew that a single fire, banked with ash for the night, could keep the room above freezing until morning. What happened to the Bakstuga? The Bakstuga peaked in the mid-1880s, with roughly 50,000 across Sweden. By the late 1800s, there were as many Bakstugusitare as torpare in the entire country. Then 3 forces converged that wiped Bakstugas off the map within a generation. The first was the Laga Skifte, a land reform law passed in 1827 that reorganized Sweden's entire agricultural landscape. The old village system, where farmers held scattered strips of land across shared fields, was replaced by consolidated farms. Each landowner's fields were combined into compact parcels, and farmers physically moved out of clustered villages onto their own land. The common land where many Bakstugas stood was swallowed up by newly consolidated private farms. Some Bakstugusitare were allowed to stay, many were not. The second was industrialization. Starting in the 1860s and accelerating through the 1890s, Swedish factories, sawmills, ironworks and railroads created paid employment for the rural poor. For the first time, a landless labourer could earn a cash wage and rent proper housing in a growing town. The children and grandchildren of Bakstugusitare moved to Gothenburg, Malmö and Stockholm, to factory towns and to America. Between 1850 and 1910, over 1 million Swedes emigrated, many from exactly the class of rural poor who had lived in backstugas. The third was shame. As Sweden modernized in the early 20th century, backstugas became symbols of a poverty the nation wanted to forget. Nobody wanted to preserve them. In many villages, the backstugas were simply torn down as new housing was built. The 1910 census recorded 22,658 backstugas. After that, the category disappeared from government records entirely. The cottages rotted in the forests, their sod roofs collapsed, and their stone walls were overgrown with moss until they looked like nothing more than a strange pile of rocks on a hillside. Who is keeping the knowledge alive? At Örsleto, just outside Falköping in western Sweden, a local historical society preserved the old backstugas along the village footpath instead of tearing them down. Today, Örsleto is Sweden's largest collection of backstugas still standing on their original sites, dating from the 1700s and 1800s, fully restored with authentic interiors. Visitors can walk inside and see the hearths, the packed earth floors, the low ceilings and small windows, exactly as the Bakstugusitari left them. The museum calls itself a place that brings to life the heritage of a vanished, impoverished Sweden. In Småland, Mariana and Anders Agertorp live on a homestead called Stensjöang, near Heradsbäck in Älmhult municipality. On their land sits a backstuga that once belonged to a man called Little John in the early 1800s. Both John's mother and his brother drowned themselves in the nearby lake, a detail preserved in local records that speaks to how hard life could be for the Bakstugusitari. The Agetorps spent years restoring Little John's backstuga and a second one nearby, rebuilding the stone walls, relaying the birch bark waterproofing and replacing the sod roofs. The restored backstugas now serve as a writer's retreat and overnight accommodation. People from around the world come to sleep in a dwelling that most Swedes have completely forgotten existed. The Dalgångsstuga, near Konga, about 13 kilometres east of Tingsryd, is another survivor. Built in 1859 by a worker who moved to the area with his wife and 3 children after finding work at a nearby ironworks, it is one of the best preserved examples of a backstuga built into a hillside. The local guidebook notes that the builder solved his housing problem with a bunch of fieldstones, a few tree trunks and a pair of strong arms. Half the building material was saved because the excavated slope formed the back wall and parts of the side walls. These are physical records of how the poorest people in one of the world's harshest climates kept themselves alive using nothing but the materials under their feet. For roughly 300 years, tens of thousands of Sweden's poorest people solved the most basic human problem, shelter from the cold, by digging into a hillside. They had no timber budget, so they used the hill as a wall. They had no roofing material, so they laid birch bark and living sod. They had no insulation, so they let the earth hold a steady temperature while the air above swung from freezing to scorching and back. The thermal logic behind it, south-facing orientation, earth-sheltered walls, sod insulation, and radiant heat from a single fire matches the principles that modern earth-sheltered home designers use today. What disappeared was not the physics. What disappeared was the social class that needed these homes. When Sweden industrialized and the Bakstugusitari moved to cities or emigrated to America, the backstugas lost their purpose. But a few survived. At Örsleto, in the forests of Småland, and in a handful of other places across southern Sweden, you can still step through a low doorway into a room that has not changed in 200 years. The walls are stone and earth, the ceiling is close, and it is warm. 50,000 of these homes once stood across Sweden. Almost all of them are gone. The ones that remain are evidence that the simplest building strategy, using the ground itself as shelter, kept people alive through centuries of Scandinavian winters using almost nothing at all. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. We investigate forgotten knowledge that the modern world left behind, not because the old ways were always better, but because some of them were remarkably effective and we forgot to ask how before they disappeared. August 4th, 1265. Simon de Montfort is killed at the Battle of Evesham. His military captain, a man named Roger Godbird, is now a wanted man. The crown declares him an outlaw, a wolf's head. Anyone can kill him on sight. Godbird disappears into Sherwood Forest. For the next 7 years, he organises raids across 3 counties, Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, as far south as Wiltshire. The sheriff can't find him. The king's men can't catch him. Local knights actively shelter him. It takes until 1272 before authorities finally capture him, and even then, he's held in 3 different prisons over 3 years before his trial at the Tower of London. The most powerful military apparatus in Europe could not locate his camp. Today, we're going to show you how that was possible. The shelters that vanished when abandoned, the fires that produced no smoke, and the security systems that warned outlaws hours before the king's men arrived. Because the medieval forest wasn't just a hiding place, it was the most effective guerrilla landscape ever used on European soil. Godbird was not unique. Medieval England produced outlaws the way a factory produces waste. The forest laws alone created criminals out of ordinary people. Under the Norman system, killing a deer on royal land could result in execution. Merely disturbing a deer could cost you your hand or your eyesight. The Sherwood Forest Eyre Courts, whose records survive from 1287 and 1334, document fines and brutal punishments for offences as minor as collecting fallen wood or grazing a pig under the king's oaks. When the penalty for feeding your family is mutilation, the forest starts looking less like a punishment and more like an escape. And only men over the age of 14 could be formally outlawed. Women received a different legal status. They were waived rather than outlawed, but the practical result was identical. Exile from the protection of law. To understand why the forest was so dangerous for the king's men and so perfect for outlaws, you need to understand the scale of what we are talking about. In the 1200s, Sherwood Forest alone covered roughly 100,000 acres. That was a fifth of the entire county of Nottinghamshire, and Sherwood was just one of dozens of royal forests. At the peak of forest law enforcement in the 13th century, an estimated 1/4 of all the land in England fell under royal forest jurisdiction. Some historians put the figure even higher for southern England, closer to 1/3. These were not parks or gardens. Large sections were dense woodland, heathland, and bog, broken by scattered settlements and threaded with unpaved tracks that turned to mud in autumn and became impassable in winter. The northern section of Sherwood, known as the High Forest, was the most remote and least settled part of the entire region. Archaeological surveys have confirmed that this area had minimal permanent habitation during the medieval period. Charcoal burners and woodsmen passed through seasonally, but no villages, no manors, no churches. For an outlaw band looking for a base of operations, it was perfect. Miles of unbroken woodland where a mounted patrol could ride for hours without seeing another human being. Now let's talk about what these camps actually looked like, because they were not crude holes in the ground. Medieval forest dwellers, and this includes not just outlaws but charcoal burners, hermits, and itinerant woodsmen, used construction techniques that had been refined over centuries of woodland living. The primary shelter was what we now call a bender tent, a structure rooted in Celtic tradition that goes back well before the medieval period. The construction was simple but effective. You cut a dozen hazel rods, each about 8 to 10 feet long, and push them into the ground in a circle or oval roughly 10 feet across. You bent the tops inward and lashed them together to create an arched dome frame. Over this frame, you layered whatever the forest provided. In summer, that meant bracken fern and leafy branches. In winter, it meant thicker layers of dead leaves, moss, and bark stripped from fallen trees. A well-built bender with 2 to 3 feet of debris layered over the frame was waterproof, windproof, and nearly invisible from more than 30 feet away. The genius was in the material selection. Hazel grows straight and flexible, which is why medieval builders preferred it for wattle fencing and hurdle construction across England. When bent into an arch, it holds its shape under load. And because hazel coppice was one of the most common woodland management practices in medieval England, there was an endless supply of straight rods in every managed forest. An experienced woodsman could cut the poles, bend the frame, and have a weatherproof shelter standing in under 3 hours. When the band needed to move, they stripped the covering, left the frame to rot back into the undergrowth, and rebuilt at the next location. Within a few weeks, the abandoned frame was indistinguishable from natural deadfall. This is why archaeologists have found almost no physical evidence of outlaw camps. The shelters were designed to disappear. They used no nails, no cut stone, no fired materials. Everything came from the forest and returned to it. The ethnoarchaeological record confirms this pattern. A 2024 study published in Ethnoarchaeology documented the temporary dwellings of charcoal burners and found that these structures left virtually no detectable traces, even with modern survey equipment. The shelters were, by design, archaeologically invisible. But shelter was only part of the equation. The real challenge was fire. A medieval forest outlaw needed fire to cook, to stay warm through English winters that regularly dropped below freezing, and to preserve meat. But fire produces smoke, and smoke rising above a forest canopy is visible for miles. This was the single greatest threat to a hidden camp, and medieval outlaws solved it using a technique that every modern survival instructor still teaches today. They dug their fires below ground level. You excavate a pit roughly 12 inches deep and 12 inches across. Then you dig a second angled tunnel that connects to the base of the fire pit from about 18 inches away. When you light the fire in the main pit, the tunnel feeds oxygen directly to the base of the flames from below. The fire burns hotter than a surface fire because the airflow is concentrated. A hotter fire means more complete combustion, and more complete combustion means drastically less smoke. What little smoke does escape rises through the pit and disperses into the surrounding tree canopy before it can form a visible column above the tree line. From ground level, you could walk within 50 feet of an underground fire pit and never see a flame. From a hilltop a mile away, you would see nothing at all. The technique works because of basic physics. Smoke is produced by incomplete combustion, particles of fuel that get hot enough to rise but not hot enough to burn completely. By forcing air directly into the base of the fire, you raise the combustion temperature and burn those particles before they become visible smoke. Medieval forest dwellers did not understand the chemistry, but they understood the result. Build your fire below ground, feed it air from a tunnel, and the king's scouts would ride straight past your camp without knowing it was there. Medieval outlaws also used dry hardwoods, oak and ash, rather than green wood or softwoods like pine. Green wood contains moisture that creates steam and visible white smoke. Resinous softwoods produce thick, dark smoke from burning sap. Seasoned hardwood burns cleaner because its moisture content is below 20% and it contains no volatile resins. Outlaws gathered deadfall that had dried on the forest floor, often for months. They broke it into small pieces to ensure rapid, complete combustion. The fire burned hot, fast, and nearly invisible. and because the pit contained the flames entirely below ground, there was no visible light after dark either. A patrol walking through the forest at night would see nothing. No flickering glow, no orange light reflecting off tree trunks. The fire was literally buried. Location selection was equally calculated. Medieval outlaw bands chose campsites the way a military commander chooses defensive terrain. They wanted higher ground, not hilltops, which are exposed, but elevated positions on slopes where they could observe approaching movement through the trees below. They wanted water within a short walk, but not directly beside it, because streams and rivers were natural travel corridors that patrols would follow. And they wanted dense undergrowth between their camp and the nearest road or track, because underbrush that a man on foot could push through became an impenetrable wall for a man on horseback. A mounted patrol in full mail could not force a warhorse through a thicket of holly, hawthorn, and blackthorn. And medieval forests were full of exactly that. The English crown understood this problem. In 1285, King Edward I passed the Statute of Winchester, one of the most revealing pieces of legislation in medieval English history. Among its provisions, the statute ordered that highways leading from one market town to another shall be enlarged so that there be neither ditch, underwood, nor bush, whereby a man may lurk to do hurt, within 200 feet on one side and 200 feet on the other side of the road. If a lord failed to clear his section of road and a robbery occurred there, the lord himself was held financially responsible. The statute even required the whole hundred, the local administrative district, to be answerable for any robbery committed in its territory. Think about what that law reveals. The most powerful king in Europe, commanding the largest military budget of any English monarch up to that point, could not solve the outlaw problem through force. So he tried to solve it by cutting down the forest itself. He ordered 200 feet of vegetation cleared on either side of every major road, essentially creating a no-man's land where outlaws could not hide. The fact that he needed this law tells you everything about how effective the forest was as cover. The king could not find the camps, so he tried to destroy the forest around the roads instead. But the camps were never near the roads. That was the point. Outlaw bands operated a security system that would be familiar to any modern guerrilla force. They posted lookouts along the approach routes to their camps. They used local sympathizers as an intelligence network. Historical records confirm that common people of the time would shelter outlaws in safe houses, feeding them information about the movements of sheriffs and their men. Roger Godbird had a prominent local knight named Richard Folliot, who actively protected him and his band from the sheriff. This was not unusual. The medieval frank pledge system, where every man belonged to a group of 10 who were responsible for each other's conduct, was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of protection. But it failed repeatedly because local communities often sympathized with the outlaws more than with the crown. The outlaws used disguise as aggressively as they used concealment. Eustace the monk, one of the most documented outlaws of the early 13th century, disguised himself as a charcoal burner, a potter, and even a woman to move undetected through the countryside and gather intelligence. Fulk Fitzwarin, a nobleman who spent 3 years as an outlaw in the forests after King John seized his lands, reportedly lured the king himself into an ambush in Bradeen Forest by using deception. These were not desperate men hiding in holes. They were organised, mobile, and tactically sophisticated. Contemporary records describe outlaw gangs riding in force by day and night, forming congregations that moved so aggressively through the counties of Nottingham, Leicester, and Derby that, according to a petition to Parliament, no one with a small company could pass through most parts without being taken and killed or spoiled of his goods. This was not petty crime. This was a parallel power structure operating from invisible bases deep in the woodland. Food and water were the final logistical challenges, and the outlaws solved both through the forest itself and through their support network. Medieval English forests were rich in wild game: deer, boar, rabbit, and birds. Poaching the king's deer was a capital offence, but when you were already sentenced to death as an outlaw, that law meant nothing. The same forests that harboured fugitives also fed them. Wild plants supplemented the diet. Hazelnuts, crabapples, berries, nettles, and wild garlic all grow abundantly in English woodland. And the network of sympathisers in nearby villages provided grain, bread, salt, and ale in exchange for a share of whatever the outlaws took from wealthy travellers on the forest roads. It was a complete supply chain, invisible to the authorities because it ran through the same rural communities the sheriff depended on for information. Water was simpler still. Medieval English forests are threaded with streams, springs, and seasonal runoff channels. The outlaws positioned camps within a few hundred feet of a reliable water source, but never directly beside it, maintaining a buffer zone that prevented their tracks from being spotted along the stream bank by anyone following the watercourse. And this brings us to the final piece of the system: mobility. Medieval outlaw bands did not stay in one camp for long. They rotated between multiple prepared sites across a wide territory. Roger Godbird's operations spanned 3 counties. Each campsite was pre-selected, and each could be rebuilt in hours. When word came through the intelligence network that the sheriff's men were moving in a particular direction, the band simply packed up, scattered through the forest along pre-established routes, and reassembled at the next site. By the time the patrol reached the old camp, there was nothing to find. No structures, no fire pit visible above ground, no cut marks on standing trees, just forest. The medieval English forest was, in every measurable way, the most effective guerrilla landscape in Europe. Dense canopy blocked observation from above. Undergrowth stopped mounted pursuit. Shelters built from living materials vanished when abandoned. Underground fires produced no visible smoke. Local networks provided early warning. And the sheer scale, tens of thousands of acres of unpoliced woodland, made systematic search impossible with the technology available. Modern military forces with satellite imagery, thermal cameras, and helicopters still struggle to locate hidden positions in dense forest cover. Medieval kings had none of those tools. They had men on horseback, tracking dogs, and a network of informants that was often more loyal to the outlaws than to the crown. The forest was not just a hiding place. It was a fortress that could not be besieged, a castle that could not be burned, and a stronghold that rebuilt itself every spring. The camps left no ruins because they were never meant to last. And that is exactly why they worked. Medieval outlaws understood something that modern survivalists pay thousands of dollars to learn at wilderness schools. The best shelter is the one that disappears when you leave it. The best fire is the one nobody can see. And the best defense is a landscape so vast and so hostile to pursuit that your enemy gives up before he starts. If you found this investigation valuable, subscribe to Medieval Way. Every week we dig into the techniques and knowledge that kept people alive when the world was actively trying to kill them. Sometime in the early 10th century, a Persian geographer named Ibn Rusta crosses into the lands of the Slavs. He is cataloguing the peoples of the known world for a geographical encyclopedia he will call the Book of Precious Records. When he reaches the forest steppe zone of what is now Western Russia, he sees something he has never encountered before. The people live underground, not in caves, not in natural formations. They have dug rectangular pits into the earth, fitted them with pointed wooden roofs that resemble the peaks of Christian churches, and covered everything in soil until the dwellings disappear into the hillside. Inside, he finds stone stoves and families who seem entirely comfortable. He writes that the cold in their country is so severe that each of them digs a kind of cellar in the ground. He does not understand the physics behind what he is seeing. Neither did anyone else for another 1,000 years. The structure was called a zemlyanka, from the Russian word zemlya, meaning earth, and the engineering principles that made it work at -49 degrees Fahrenheit, -45 degrees Celsius, are only now being validated by modern building science. Today we are going to show you how these shelters were built, what made them work, and how 5 interlocking systems turned a hole in the ground into the most thermally efficient dwelling ever constructed without modern technology. Ibn Rusta was not the only outside observer to document these structures. An anonymous Persian manuscript from the same era described Slavic winter dwellings even more directly. The Slavs spend their winters in hollows and underground huts. These were not emergency shelters thrown together in a crisis. Archaeological evidence from Central and Eastern Europe, from modern-day Belarus, Ukraine, and southwestern Russia shows that semi-subterranean dwellings were the dominant residential form across the entire forest steppe zone from the 5th century through the 10th century. That is 500 years of continuous use. Half a millennium of families being born, raised, and dying of old age in homes carved into the earth. In 2005, archaeologists excavating a 9th century Slavic settlement near Novgorod counted 23 foundation pits in a single village. Everyone had been dug below ground level. Not because these people lacked the tools to build above the surface, not because they lacked timber. The surrounding forests stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. They dug because at -49 degrees Fahrenheit, -45 degrees Celsius, a house that sits on the surface of the earth is a death trap. To understand why, you need to understand one fact about soil temperature that changes everything about winter construction. At a depth of about 10 feet, 3 meters, the temperature of the ground stabilizes. It does not follow the seasons. Surface air in central Russia swings from 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, in July to -49 degrees Fahrenheit, -45 degrees Celsius in January, a range of 144 degrees. The soil at 10 feet, 3 meters absorbs it all and barely moves. Research published in Renewable and Sustainable Energy Reviews quantified this precisely. The temperature peaks of summer do not reach a depth of 10 feet, 3 meters, until 3 months after the surface peaks. The coldest surface temperatures in January do not arrive at that depth until April. The Earth does not merely insulate, it time-shifts temperature, smoothing out the brutal swings that destroy modern heating budgets. At depth, the ground temperature in the Russian forest zone stabilizes between roughly 39 and 43 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 and 6 degrees Celsius, winter and summer, year after year. Not warm, but not -45. That gap, over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees Celsius, between the surface air and the surrounding soil, is the difference between survival and death. And Russian peasants exploited it with nothing more than a shovel, an axe, and a knowledge of terrain that had been refined across centuries. The first decision in building a zemlyanka was site selection, and it was the most important choice in the entire process. A zemlyanka builder did not look for flat ground. He looked for a south-facing slope, ideally at an angle between 15 and 30 degrees, with the entrance oriented to the south or southeast. This single choice accomplished 3 things simultaneously. Digging into a hillside rather than straight down meant the slope itself did half the excavation work and created a natural drainage gradient that pulled groundwater and snowmelt away from the living space. The south-facing orientation captured passive solar heat through the entrance and any small window openings during the short winter days when every degree of warmth mattered. And the slope formed a natural windbreak against the dominant north and northwest winds that carry Siberian cold fronts across the steppe at speeds that strip heat from any exposed surface. The excavation created a rectangular pit, typically 10 to 13 feet, 3 to 4 meters, wide, and 13 to 20 feet, 4 to 6 meters long. Archaeological excavations of early Slavic semi-subterranean dwellings show foundation pits between 1 and 4 feet, 0.3 and 1.2 meters, deep, but full zemlyanki built for Siberian conditions went much further, 5 to 6 feet, 1.5 to 1.8 meters below the surface. At that depth, a person standing inside could touch the ceiling. These homes were not spacious, they were warm, and in a climate where exposed skin freezes in under 20 minutes, warmth is the only measurement that counts. The walls were reinforced with logs, spruce, pine, or birch, stacked horizontally and notched at the corners using the same joinery techniques used for above-ground log construction across Russia. But the placement was fundamentally different. The log walls were set directly against the earthen pit walls, with packed clay or moss filling every gap between the timber and the soil. This created a double wall system. The inner log surface provided structural integrity and a dry, habitable interior face that could be sealed and maintained. The outer earth mass provided thermal storage capacity that no thickness of modern fiberglass or spray foam can replicate. The log wall kept the living space dry. The earth kept it warm. 2 materials, 2 functions, 1 integrated system. Here is where the physics becomes remarkable. Soil has an R value of approximately 0.25 per inch. That sounds pathetic compared to modern rigid foam insulation, which runs about R5 per inch, 20 times higher. But R value only measures resistance to heat flow. It says nothing about thermal mass, which is the ability of a material to absorb heat, store it, and release it slowly over time. Thermal mass is the entire reason a zemlyanka works. The surrounding earth acted as a battery. During the day, when the stove burned and body heat filled the small space, the earth walls absorbed the excess warmth and stored it deep in the soil mass. At night, when the fire died down, those same walls radiated stored heat back into the living space for hours. A modern stick-framed wall insulated to R19 resists heat transfer well, but it stores almost nothing. The moment the furnace shuts off, the temperature drops. A zemlyanka surrounded by several feet of packed earth experienced temperature swings measured in fractions of a degree. The earth dampened everything. Put that into real numbers. A zemlyanka at 5 feet, 1.5 meters of depth, sat in soil that never dropped below roughly 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius, even when the air above was 43 degrees colder. The stove and the body heat of a family of 6, generating roughly 600 watts, only needed to push the interior temperature up by 27 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, not the 94 degrees, 52 degrees Celsius a surface house would require. That is the thermal advantage. The ground does most of the work before the fire is even lit. The roof was the most vulnerable point, and the builders treated it accordingly. A central ridge beam, supported by forked posts at each end of the pit, carried rafters that sloped down to the top of the earth walls. Over the rafters went overlapping layers of birch bark, nature's waterproof membrane. Birch bark contains suberin, a waxy lipid compound that makes it nearly impervious to water penetration. Scandinavian and Russian builders relied on birch bark for centuries because it does not rot, does not absorb water, and maintains its integrity for decades without maintenance. Over the birch bark went a thick layer of moss for additional insulation, then a final covering of sod or packed earth, 8 to 12 inches, 20 to 30 centimeters thick. The finished roof was an extension of the ground itself. From any distance, a zemlyanka looked like a low mound in the hillside with a timber door and a thin column of smoke rising from a small vent. It was not camouflaged on purpose. It was invisible because it was built from the landscape. The entrance was engineered as an airlock, though no one used that word for another 1,000 years. A sloped passageway led from the surface down into the main living space, with a timber door at the outer end and often a curtain or second barrier at the inner threshold. Cold air is denser than warm air. It sinks. Every time someone opened the outer door, the frigid air rushed in but pooled at the lowest point of the passageway instead of displacing the warm air inside the main room. The passage acted as a thermal trap, holding the cold air in a buffer zone that protected the living space. Modern passive house designers call this an entryway vestibule. They publish papers about it. Russian peasants dug one into every hillside 1,000 years ago. The stove completed the system. A Russian clay stove, the pechka, was not a fireplace. It was a masonry thermal mass heater built from clay bricks or rammed earth, with an internal labyrinth of flue channels that forced hot smoke to travel a long, winding path before reaching the chimney. That extended contact between hot gases and the masonry walls meant the stove absorbed 80 to 90% of the fire's heat energy before any exhaust left the building. A single firing of 45 to 60 minutes could heat the stove's thermal mass enough to radiate warmth for 12 to 24 hours. A modern open fireplace captures roughly 10 to 15% of the heat it produces. The rest goes straight up the chimney. Ibn Rushd described the Slavic method of heating stones until they were red hot, a practice that predates the developed pechka but follows the identical principle. Capture the heat in mass. Let the mass release it slowly. Do not waste energy fighting the air. Now combine these systems: earth walls absorbing and radiating heat, a stove that captures up to 90% of combustion energy and releases it over 24 hours, an airlock entrance that traps cold air before it reaches the living space, a birch bark and sod roof that seals moisture out while insulating from above, a south-facing orientation that captures every minute of winter sunlight. This was not one clever trick. It was 5 interlocking systems working simultaneously, and when they ran together, a Zemlyanka family burned 1/4 to 1/3 of the firewood consumed by an equivalent above-ground log cabin in the same climate. That savings was not marginal. It was the difference between having enough fuel to last until April and running out in February. An Intech Open review of earth-sheltered housing confirmed that energy savings of 60 to 70% are achievable in temperate zones, with studies documenting up to 72% savings in extreme climates. The US Department of Energy has stated that earth-sheltered construction can reduce heating energy use by up to 80% compared to conventional buildings. So why did we stop building this way? 3 forces killed the Zemlyanka, and none of them had anything to do with thermal performance. The first was social stigma. As Russian society stratified, the visible height of your home became a measure of status. A Zemlyanka is invisible by design. It does not announce wealth. It does not rise above the tree line. In a culture increasingly organized around outward displays of prosperity, a home that disappeared into a hillside was an embarrassment. Not because it failed as shelter, but because it failed as a symbol. The second was government policy. By the 19th century, reform programs under the Russian Empire actively discouraged pit house construction. Sanitarians and urban planners associated underground living with disease, dampness, and backwardness, despite the fact that a well-built Zemlyanka was often drier than most above-ground peasant houses, thanks to its drainage design and the moisture-wicking properties of packed earth walls. The perception overpowered the physics. The third force was Soviet industrialization. The state needed speed and standardization. Repeatable floor plans that could be stamped across a continent in 5-year production cycles. A Zemlyanka is site-specific by nature. everyone shaped by its slope, its soil, its orientation to the sun. You cannot mass-produce a structure that depends on reading the land, so the knowledge was abandoned in favor of precast concrete apartment blocks erected in months. Those same blocks were poured without adequate insulation. Soviet-era housing studies estimate that heat losses in residential buildings reached up to 66%. In Siberian cities, district heating systems consumed staggering amounts of natural gas just to keep interior walls above freezing. In January 2024, a failure in the main heating network in Novosibirsk sent entire neighborhoods into crisis. Pipes burst, steam erupted from the pavement, and families in concrete towers waited days for repairs in temperatures below -4 degrees Fahrenheit, -20 degrees Celsius. The knowledge did not vanish everywhere. In Yakutia, the coldest permanently inhabited region on Earth, the traditional Yakut Balagan, a log structure buried under 24 to 28 inches, 60 to 70 centimeters of packed earth and plastered in a clay and cattle dung mixture, housed families through winters that routinely hit -58 degrees Fahrenheit, -50 degrees Celsius. Some had windows made from river ice, replaced 3 or 4 times per season. During the Second World War, Soviet soldiers built zemlyanki by the thousands along the Eastern Front. Field shelters that could be constructed in hours and kept men alive in conditions that killed exposed troops overnight. And in Scandinavia and Russia today, experimental archaeology groups continue to build and test traditional semi-subterranean designs, confirming that the thermal principles hold up exactly as the builders intended. The average American household spends over $600 on natural gas heating per winter. In the Northeast, families using electricity pay nearly $1,400. Globally, buildings account for roughly 40% of total energy consumption, and space heating is the single largest component. We chose speed, height, and standardization over thermal performance. We traded a shelter that ran on physics for one that runs on infrastructure. And when the infrastructure fails, when the pipes burst on the wrong night in the wrong city, there is no fallback. No thermal mass storing yesterday's heat. No earth walls radiating warmth at 3 a.m. Just cold concrete and a repair crew that may or may not arrive before the pipes freeze. You do not need a hillside in Siberia to apply this. The core physics work everywhere winter exists. A south-facing slope, even a gentle one, with 3 feet, 1 meter, of earth cover over a waterproofed roof transforms the thermal equation entirely. The earth becomes your insulation, your thermal battery, and your buffer against every temperature extreme the atmosphere throws at the surface. Modern earth-sheltered homes based on these principles save over $3,000 per year in energy costs according to university research, and the savings increase every time energy prices rise. The initial construction cost runs roughly 20% higher than conventional framing, but the annual energy savings offset that premium within a decade. After that, the savings are permanent. A zemlyanka was not primitive. It was a passive heating system disguised as a hole in the ground. It ran on physics, cost nothing to operate, and never failed because a pipe burst or a grid went down. Russian peasants did not have R-value charts, energy modeling software, or building codes. What they had was a principle observed and passed down for 1,000 years. The ground stays warm when the air does not. Build into it. Let the earth do the work. And 500 years of unbroken use proved they were right. If you found this investigation valuable, subscribe to Medieval Way. Every week we dig into the techniques and knowledge that kept people alive when the world offered no safety net. February 19, 2005. At an open-air archaeological museum in Suffolk, England, an accidental fire takes hold in a thatched timber house. By the time firefighters arrive, the structure is gone. Oak posts, plank floor, thatched roof, all of it. What remains is a sub-rectangular hole in the ground, about 13 feet, 4 metres long, and 10 feet, 3 metres wide, with the charred outline of every original timber traced precisely into the sandy soil. The house was a reconstruction built between 1992 and 1998 over the foundations of a real Anglo-Saxon pit house excavated decades earlier on the same site. Its destruction was not a tragedy. It was the most detailed forensic record of an Anglo-Saxon pit house ever produced. Archaeologist Jess Tipper led the post-fire investigation and published the findings in a 2012 monograph for East Anglian archaeology, and what he described was not a hut. It was a system, a pit dug more than 5 feet, 1.6 metres, deep into sandy heath, 6 oak posts taller than a modern bus, a suspended plank floor laid over a storage cavity, a thatched roof rising 16 feet, 5 metres, to an oak ridge beam, no nails, no iron fixings, just oak, sand, straw and clay, built by people who did not own a stove, did not have a chimney, and did not know the word insulation. And on the coldest nights of a Saxon winter, winters that in the worst cold cycles of the late antique Little Ice Age could plunge well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, well below minus 18 degrees Celsius, across northern Europe, that house stayed warm enough to live in. Today we are going to show you how that was possible. The Saxons themselves were a Germanic confederation that emerged in northern Germany, modern Lower Saxony, Schleswig-Holstein and Westphalia, over the first centuries AD and pushed across the North Sea into Britain in the migration era from roughly 410 onwards. The form of building they brought with them on both sides of that sea was the sunken featured building, called a Grubenhaus on the continent and a pit house in English archaeology. It is the single most defining feature of early Saxon settlement. At Mucking in Essex, archaeologist Margaret Ursula Jones excavated more than 200 of them between 1965 and 1978, the most extensive Anglo-Saxon settlement ever excavated. At West Stow in Suffolk, around 70 were documented from a village occupied between the mid-5th and early 7th centuries. At Warendorf in Westphalia, the German archaeologist Wilhelm Winkelmann excavated a later continental Saxon village from 1951 onwards, dating to the 7th through 9th centuries, that contained dozens more. Across the entire range from England to the German plains, the same form repeats. There is a real scholarly debate about exactly what these buildings were used for. Some clearly served as weaving sheds, identified by clusters of clay loom weights from warp-weighted looms. Some were workshops or stores. Others, with hearths preserved either at the pit floor or collapsed in from a higher level, appear to have been heated dwellings. Oxford archaeologist Helena Hamerow, whose 2002 book on early medieval rural settlement is the standard reference for the period, treats them as a versatile architectural type that filled multiple roles in the same village. Whether any given pit house was a weaver's workshop, a winter dwelling, or both, one thing is consistent across the evidence. Where they were heated with a single open fire. No stove, no chimney, no masonry heat exchanger. The cold those buildings had to survive was not theoretical. In early 536 AD, an enormous volcanic eruption sent a dust veil into the northern hemisphere that dimmed the sun for more than a year. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave its light without brightness, like the moon, for the whole year. The Roman senator Cassiodorus, writing 2 years later, added that frost was striking during the harvest, making apples harden and grapes sour. Tree ring chronologies analysed by climatologist Ulf Bündgen and his team at the Swiss Federal Research Institute, published in Nature Geoscience in 2016, show that European summer temperatures dropped by up to 2.7 degrees Celsius, 4.9 degrees Fahrenheit, below normal after a second eruption around 540, and stayed depressed for more than a century. The Bündgen group described it as the most dramatic cooling of the last 2,000 years. Crops failed. The Justinianic plague swept Europe, and the Saxon migration into Britain, already underway, continued through that period of upheaval, carrying the pit house tradition with it across the North Sea. Now let's talk about how those buildings were actually constructed. The first decision was the ground itself. A Saxon pit house was only as dry as the earth it sat in. At West Stow, every excavated foundation cuts into a sandy heath that drains rainfall almost as fast as it falls. At Mucking, the underlying gravel terrace performed the same job. Saxon builders avoided clay soil and avoided low-lying ground. The pit had to drain. A pit that flooded was a damp grave. Where the terrain allowed, builders preferred well-drained ground that could shed water clear of the structure, and a southern exposure where it could capture what little winter sunlight a northern European December offers. The excavation was modest by modern standards. 2 people, working with iron-tipped wooden spades and pointed digging sticks, could cut the pit in a few days. The shape was a rectangle or rounded rectangle, typically 8 to 14 feet, 2.5 to 4 meters, long and 7 to 10 feet, 2 to 3 meters wide. The depth varied across the archaeological record from a shallow scrape of around 1 to 2 feet, 0.3 to 0.6 meters, at smaller sites up to more than 5 feet, 1.6 meters, at the largest and best built houses. Tipper's reconstructed farmer's house at West Stow sat at the deeper end. Its pit was 13 feet by 10 feet by 5 feet 4 inches deep, 4 meters by 3 meters by 1.6 meters. Around the perimeter of the pit, post holes were dug deeper still. The most common configurations were 2-post and 6-post arrangements. The 2-post type carried a ridge beam directly between the gable ends. The 6-post type added 2 more posts at each end, creating a sturdier frame for a heavier roof. The farmer's house used 6 oak posts, the largest more than 20 feet, 6.25 meters, long, sunk far below the pit floor for stability. These were not small structures. The post timbers alone outweighed an adult horse. Once the posts were standing, the pit walls themselves had to be lined. Bare earth would have collapsed inward over a single wet winter. Saxon builders solved this by setting vertical oak planks or woven hazel rods into a slot cut along the inside edge of the pit, packed against the surrounding soil with clay and moss. The plank lining served 2 functions at once. It held the earth in place, and it created a finished interior surface that could be sealed against drafts and dampness. In many of the best-built houses, including the farmer's house at West Stow, a suspended plank floor was then laid across joists set into the upper edges of the pit. The cavity beneath that floor served as a cool, dry storage cellar. In other pit houses, the floor of the pit itself was the working surface, and the cellar cavity did not exist. Tipper's forensic study confirmed something else worth pausing on. Across the entire farmer's house, there were no nails, no iron straps, no metal fixings of any kind. Every joint was cut by hand and held by wedge, peg, or notch. The structure was pure carpentry. Above the pit, the rest of the house rose into the open air. Plank or wattle and daub walls extended from the surface upward to meet the rafters, and the rafters in turn carried the most thermally important component of the whole building, the roof. Saxon roofs were thatched, typically with straw, reed, or heather, depending on what grew nearby, laid in overlapping bundles 9 to 12 inches, 20 to 30 centimetres, thick. Thatching is one of those techniques that sounds primitive until you measure it. Modern building science gives reed and straw thatch a thermal conductivity of 0.07 to 0.09 watts per metre Kelvin, which translates to an R value somewhere between R11 and R14 for a standard 9 to 12 inch layer. In plain terms, that is roughly equivalent to 4 inches 10 centimetres of modern fiberglass batt insulation. The reason it works so well is microscopic. A bundle of reed or straw is mostly air, millions of tiny pockets trapped between hollow stems. And air, held perfectly still, is the best cheap insulator on the planet. The same principle that makes a down jacket warm is the principle that makes a thatched roof warm. The Saxons did not know the thermal conductivity of their reeds. They knew that a thick thatched roof, properly pitched and properly maintained, could hold heat for a winter. The pitch was steep, around 45 to 55 degrees, so snow slid off rather than soaking in and dragging the structure down. And the deep eaves overhung the wall heads, throwing rainwater clear of the timber and the soil banked against the lower walls. That was the envelope. Earth below, plank and wattle around, and a thatched roof above. Inside that envelope sat the only heat source the house possessed. The hearth was a clay platform set in the centre of the floor, sometimes directly on the pit base, sometimes on the suspended plank deck above it, and on it burned a small open fire. There was no chimney. There was no flue. Smoke from the fire rose into the apex of the thatched roof and worked its way out through gaps in the thatch and through openings near the gable ends. Modern reconstructions confirm that interiors were genuinely smoky. By the standards of any indoor air quality regulation written in the last century, an Anglo-Saxon pit house in midwinter would have failed every test. That is the honest part of the story. But the smoky interior is also the system at work, because the smoke was the price of the heat, and the heat was the price of survival. Chimneys would not become standard features of vernacular Northern European housing until the late medieval and early modern periods. The masonry skill required to build a sealed flue with a draft-managed firebox was beyond what a Saxon village carpenter could economically deliver. And even if one had been built, a chimney rising vertically out of the roof would have functioned as a heat loss column, sucking the warm interior air straight up and out. In the system the Saxons actually built, the smoke vented horizontally near the eaves. The heat was held in by the thick thatch and the surrounding earth, and the warm air above the fire dispersed across the shoulders of the inhabitants rather than getting pulled out of flue. Anyone who has ever sat near a campfire on a cold night already knows the principle. The fire warms what is in front of it. Walls that hold that warmth in turn make the small fire enough. A well-stocked open fire produces a gross thermal output of around 5 to 18 kilowatts. That is a serious amount of heat, comparable to a modern domestic gas boiler. The catch is efficiency. Of that gross output, only 10 to 15% ends up actually warming the room in a traditional open hearth arrangement. The rest goes up through the smoke vent, out the gable openings, or into the convective draft that pulls air through the building. In a modern stick-framed house, that loss is fatal. 85% of your heat vanishing into the sky means the fire might as well be outside. But the Saxon pit house was not a modern stick-framed house. The footprint was tiny, often only 100 to 130 square feet, 9 to 12 square meters. Small enough that even a kilowatt or two of net heat input could lift the interior temperature several degrees above whatever the surrounding earth was already doing for it. Each adult sitting inside that space radiated another 80 to 100 watts of body heat continuously. Sometimes livestock shared the space, adding more. The fire was a contributor to the system, not the entire system, and without the system, the fire alone would have failed. This brings us to the chemistry of the ground itself, and to the reason a hole in the right kind of soil outperforms a stick-framed house at any winter temperature you care to name. Soil as an insulator is mediocre. Standard heat transfer tables put the R value of dry soil at about R0.25 per inch, which is roughly 20 times worse than modern rigid foam. If a Saxon pit house relied on soil to block heat from escaping the way modern wall foam does, it would have been useless. It did not. It relied on soil to do something foam cannot do: store heat. The relevant property is thermal mass, also called heat capacity. Earth absorbs heat slowly, holds enormous quantities of it, and releases it slowly. The deeper into the ground you go, the more stable the temperature becomes, because the surface seasons take longer and longer to penetrate. The United States Department of Energy publishes guidance on this for modern earth-sheltered construction, and the numbers are striking. At a depth of just 5 to 10 feet, 1.5 to 3 meters, soil temperature in temperate climates stabilizes between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 to 16 degrees Celsius, year-round, regardless of what the air does above. A 2024 review in the Journal of Cleaner Production, led by Julie Mihalakaku and colleagues, surveyed the modern earth-sheltered building literature and confirmed that earth-sheltered structures can cut heating energy use by up to 80% in optimal configurations, with substantial savings even in modest temperate climate applications. That is what a Saxon pit floor at 5 feet, 1.5 meters of depth was already delivering to its occupants for free. The mechanism is thermal lag. At 3 to 6 feet, 1 to 2 meters of depth, the range of a Saxon pit floor, the soil temperature does not match the surface air. It matches the surface air from 1 to 3 months earlier and at greater depths from up to 6 months earlier. In January, when the winter outside is at its coldest, the ground a few feet below your feet is still tracking the warmth of late autumn. It sits at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, when the air above is at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 18 degrees Celsius. The walls and floor of the pit do not merely block the cold. They are warmer than the interior air, and they radiate that warmth steadily into the room. This is the same physics that keeps a wine cellar near 50 degrees in August and near 50 degrees in February. Soil is enormous compared to the volume of air inside any small building. Several feet of packed earth contains so much mass and so much stored heat that the daily and seasonal swings of the surface air cannot reach them quickly enough to register. The thatched roof, with its R11 to R14 of trapped air insulation, holds the warm interior air against escape. The small open fire and the body heat of the family contribute the marginal energy needed to lift the interior from the soil's 50 degrees to a livable 60 or 65 degrees Fahrenheit, around 16 to 18 degrees Celsius. And the earth surrounding the structure on 5 sides behaves like a thermal flywheel. Heat that radiates from the fire into the walls is absorbed by the soil, then re-released over the long, quiet hours of the night when the fire has burned down to coals. Saxon peasants did not know the words heat capacity, thermal lag, or radiant transfer. They did not measure the R value of straw. They knew that a hole dug into well-drained ground, walled with oak, roofed with thatch, and warmed by a single fire stayed livable on nights when the world above was frozen solid. They built their villages around that observation, and the form they built outlasted them by half a millennium. By the 12th century, nearly a third of England's territory was designated Royal Forest. Hunting a deer in those woods could get you blinded. Cutting a branch could cost you a hand, and simply being found living among the trees without authorization made you a criminal under Norman forest law. Tens of thousands of people lived there anyway. Outlaws, charcoal burners, poachers and fugitives built a shelter specifically designed for a world where getting caught meant losing your hands or your life. It needed no tools that could be confiscated. It used no materials that could not be found within 50 paces. It went up in 30 minutes, came down in 5, and after a season of rain and leaf fall, the site looked like untouched forest floor. No foundation, no post holes, no nails, no archaeological signature whatsoever. Modern archaeologists need ground-penetrating radar to find where these shelters once stood. Medieval forest wardens, searching on horseback, had no chance. The shelter was called a bender tent, and once you understand how it worked, you will never look at a modern campsite the same way again. The name tells you almost everything. A bender is exactly what it sounds like. You take flexible branches, hazel, willow, or ash, and you bend them. That is the entire structural principle. No joinery, no lashing, no frame assembly. The natural elasticity of green wood does all the engineering. Here is what a medieval outlaw or charcoal burner actually did. He walked into a hazel coppice, and hazel coppices were everywhere in medieval England because hazel was managed and harvested on rotation for fencing, wattle walls and fuel. He cut roughly a dozen rods, each about 10 feet, 3 meters long and around 2 inches, 5 centimeters thick at the base. That is all the material he needed for the frame. He pushed the thick ends into the ground in 2 parallel rows, 5 rods on each side, spaced about 2 feet, 60 centimeters apart. Then he bent each rod across to the opposite side and pushed the thin end into the ground on the far row. The result was 5 arches side by side, forming a tunnel shape roughly 8 to 10 feet, 2.5 to 3 meters wide, and 4 feet, 1.2 meters tall at the center. 2 more rods closed off the back end. The front stayed open as a doorway. That was the frame. No rope, no pegs, no cordage of any kind. The ground held the ends, and the natural spring tension of the hazel held the arch. Traditional Romani builders in Wales used a tool called a kettle prop, essentially a pointed stick, to punch the holes in the ground before inserting the rods. That was the only tool besides a cutting blade. The covering is what turned this frame from a skeleton into a shelter that could block driving English rain for weeks. Medieval forest dwellers used whatever they had. Animal hides were the oldest option. A single deerskin stretched across the top of a bender created a waterproof roof with no treatment required. Wool cloth was more common by the 13th century, and wool has a property that most people today do not appreciate. Lanolin. Raw wool contains natural lanolin, a waxy substance that repels water. A tightly woven wool blanket draped over a bender frame sheds rain almost as effectively as a modern waterproof fabric. Not water-resistant, waterproof. The fibers swell when wet, closing the gaps in the weave, and the lanolin coating causes water to bead and run off rather than soak through. For longer-term camps, the covering could be treated with linseed oil or beeswax to increase waterproofing further. The process was simple. Rub the oil or wax into the cloth, let it cure in the sun, and the fabric becomes genuinely impervious to water. This is the same principle behind modern waxed canvas jackets, which cost $200 or more. Medieval forest dwellers figured it out with a handful of beeswax and a wool blanket. The covering was laid over the frame in overlapping sections so that each upper layer shed water onto the layer below it, exactly like roof shingles. No stitching required. Gravity and overlap did the work. The open front faced away from the prevailing wind, and in heavy rain, a spare cloth could be draped across the opening. Inside, the occupant gathered bracken, heather, or dry leaves and piled them 6 to 8 inches, 15 to 20 centimeters, deep as ground insulation. This layer kept body heat from draining into the cold earth, the same principle that modern sleeping pads are designed around. A wool cloak served as both blanket and outer garment. The entire sleep system weighed nothing, cost nothing, and used no material that could not be found in the forest within an hour. But the bender tent was not just a survival shelter. it was a disappearing act. This is the detail that made benders uniquely suited to people living outside the law. Every component was biodegradable. The hazel rods, once the covering was removed, would spring back upright and eventually blend into the surrounding undergrowth. The holes in the ground filled with leaf litter within days. The bracken bedding decomposed in weeks. The fire pit, if one was used at all, could be scattered and covered with forest debris. Within a single season, the site was indistinguishable from untouched woodland. This is not speculation. In 2021, Patrick Wiley, an archaeologist at University College London, began one of the first doctoral theses ever written on Romani archaeology. Part of his research focused on bender tent sites in Epping Forest, where as many as 300 Romanicals had lived for well over a century until their forced eviction in 1897. Wiley needed ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and magnetic susceptibility testing, technologies that detect changes in soil composition invisible to the naked eye, just to locate where the camps had been. The hard-packed earthen floors showed up on radar. Buried hearth remains registered on magnetometry scans. But on the surface, walking through the forest, there was nothing to see. If 21st century technology struggles to find these sites, imagine what a 12th century forest warden faced. He was riding through dense woodland, looking for people who built shelters from the same material as the trees around them, covered them with earth-coloured wool, and broke camp every few days. The bender tent was not just a shelter, it was camouflage, and this is where the history becomes darker. Medieval forest law was not a bureaucratic inconvenience. Under the Norman kings, the royal forests operated under a separate legal system enforced by appointed foresters. Before the Charter of the Forest in 1217, punishments for forest crimes were brutal. Disturbing a deer could result in blinding. Killing one to feed your family could mean execution. Even cutting wood, the very material a bender tent required, was a punishable offence. The Charter of the Forest, signed 2 years after the Magna Carta, reformed the worst of these punishments. The death penalty for poaching was abolished. Mutilation was outlawed. But heavy fines and imprisonment remained standard, and the forests continued to be patrolled. For the thousands of people who had been declared outlaw, meaning they were stripped of all legal protection and could be killed on sight by anyone, the forest was both refuge and prison. Charcoal burners occupied a strange middle ground. Their profession required them to live deep in the woods for weeks at a time, tending slow-burning charcoal pits that could not be left unattended. Historical records from the New Forest describe charcoal burners erecting shelters from larch poles and covered frameworks, structures nearly identical to bender tents. They were tolerated because the economy needed charcoal, but they were also socially outcast. During the Middle Ages, charcoal burners were frequently accused of evil practices and considered dishonourable. This made them perfect allies for fugitives. A charcoal burner's camp deep in the woods was one of the few places an outlaw could hide with a legitimate cover story. Historical sources confirm that charcoal burner communities served as a largely segregated population that could provide refuge for outsiders and fugitives. The bender tent was the architecture of this underground network, cheap, fast, invisible, and shared between the legally marginal and the legally dead. The most famous charcoal burner in English history was a man named Purkis, who in the year 1100 found the body of King William II in the New Forest after the king was killed by an arrow during a hunt. Purkis loaded the body into his cart and transported it to Winchester. A charcoal burner living in a temporary shelter in the woods was the first person to find a dead king. That tells you how deep into the forest these people lived. So if a shelter this effective could be built in half an hour with free materials, why has it vanished from public knowledge? Part of the answer is social prejudice. The bender tent survived longest among Romani communities, who continued building them well into the 20th century. At Thorny Hill in the New Forest, nearly 400 Romani people lived in bender tents and tin shacks through the 1930s. They were subject to forest bylaws that prohibited fixed floors in dwellings, a rule specifically designed to keep their homes temporary and removable. One water tap served the entire community. By 1942, the population had declined to 161. By the 1960s, prefabricated houses began replacing the benders. The people who knew how to build bender tents were the people whose knowledge was never recorded in manuals, never taught in schools, and never valued by the society around them. When those communities were broken up, the knowledge scattered with them, but it did not disappear completely. And here is how you build one yourself. You need a dozen hazel or willow rods, each about 10 feet, 3 meters long, and roughly 2 inches, 5 centimeters, thick at the base. Green wood, freshly cut, bends without cracking. Seasoned wood snaps. That distinction matters. Lay out your footprint. Mark 2 parallel rows about 8 feet, 2.5 meters, apart, with 5 insertion points on each side spaced roughly 2 feet, 60 centimeters, apart. Use a pointed stick or the handle of your knife to punch holes about 6 to 12 inches, 15 to 30 centimeters, deep at each mark. Push the thick end of the first rod into the ground on one side. Walk to the opposite mark, bend the rod over in a smooth arc, and push the thin end into the ground. Repeat for all 5 pairs. You now have 5 arches. Add 2 rods to close the back end by pushing them into the ground at the corners and bending them to meet at the center. For the covering, use a wool blanket, a canvas tarp, or, for maximum waterproofing, waxed canvas. Lay the covering over the frame starting at the back and working forward, with each section overlapping the one below it by at least 6 inches, 15 centimeters. Secure the edges with rocks or logs at the base. No stakes needed. Gather bracken, dry leaves, or pine needles and pile them at least 6 inches, 15 centimeters, deep across the entire interior floor. This is your insulation. Without it, the cold ground will drain your body heat regardless of how good your covering is. Orient the open end away from the prevailing wind. If rain is coming from the opening side, hang a cloth across the doorway. Your first attempt will take about an hour. By your 3rd or 4th build, you will be under 30 minutes. A skilled builder can have this shelter standing and weatherproof before a modern backpacker finishes unpacking their tent. The bender tent is not a museum piece. It is a functioning shelter design that outlasted the Roman Empire, survived Norman forest law, sheltered communities for centuries, and requires nothing that the forest does not freely provide. The medieval outlaw who built one did not have a survival manual. He had knowledge passed from person to person, generation to generation, among the people who lived closest to the land. That knowledge was never written down because it belonged to people who were never asked to write anything down. Charcoal burners, Romani families, forest fugitives, the people the chronicles ignored. Now you have it.